It was Thanksgiving dinner, the one holiday my mother-in-law always treated like her personal coronation. When my husband slammed his palms on the table hard enough to rattle the wine glasses, looked me dead in the eye in front of his entire family and told me I was a liar, a cheat, and a disgrace to his name, 30 people went silent. His grandmother stalked Michu. The kids froze. And me? I reached into the front pocket of my cardigan, wrapped my fingers around my phone, and thought, okay, okay, let's do this. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a quiet, conflict avoiding woman from Mississauga ended up burning down her own marriage on a Thursday night in November, and why I don't regret a single second of it. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old. I work in healthcare administration. I am, by most accounts, a patient person. My colleagues call me the calm one. My friends joke that nothing rattles me. I grew up in a household where my parents talked things through at the kitchen table, where disagreements ended with someone making tea, where we don't air our dirty laundry was practically stitched on a throw pillow. I believed in working things out quietly. I believed that patience was a form of love. 5 years of marriage taught me that patience in the wrong house just feeds the beast. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was not a bad man when I met him. He was warm and funny, and he made me feel seen in that particular way that makes you think, yes, this is the person. We got married in the Niagara region on a clear September afternoon. My dress was ivory, his grandmother cried. I thought I was walking into a family. What I actually walked into was his mother's kingdom. She had lived with us since year 2, just temporarily, my husband said. Her condo situation is complicated. The condo situation was never resolved. She never left. Her name was, well, I'll call her my mother-in-law, because that's how she thought of herself too, as a role, as an institution, as someone whose position in the household was non-negotiable. She was a compact woman in her early 60s who wore her silver hair like armor and had a gift for making you feel stupid without ever technically insulting you. She'd look at the dinner I'd spent 2 hours making and say, "Oh, you use dried herbs. Interesting." She'd hand back the sweater I bought her for Christmas with a receipt-shaped smile and say she already had something similar. She would ask, in front of guests, whether I planned to finish my master's degree someday, emphasis on someday, the way you'd say it about a child who'd announced they wanted to be an astronaut. My husband saw none of it, or he saw it and decided it was easier not to. Either way, when I brought it up, the answer was always some version of, "That's just how she is," or "You're being sensitive," or my personal favorite, "She means well." His younger brother lived nearby, 20 minutes away, in a condo in Oakville, with his wife, who I'll call my sister-in-law. She was a few years older than me, striking in a way that made you feel slightly underdressed even in your own home. She and my mother-in-law had a closeness that I always thought was a little unusual, but I told myself I was imagining things. Some families are just more physical in their affection, I thought. Some people hug longer. Some people lean in when they talk. Some people share a look across a room that seems to carry an entire conversation. I told myself I was imagining things for about 8 months before I stopped imagining things. The first sign I couldn't explain away happened in early March. I'd come home from a late shift. I sometimes cover administrative emergencies at the hospital, which means odd hours, and the house was dark except for the kitchen light. I went to get a glass of water and I heard voices on the back porch. Low voices. My brother-in-law's car was in the driveway, which was odd since my sister-in-law had texted me that afternoon to say he was away for work. I didn't go out to the porch. I stood in the kitchen in my coat and I drank my water and I listened to the murmur of voices I couldn't quite make out, and something cold settled in the bottom of my stomach. I went to bed and I told myself it meant nothing. But then I started noticing other things. The way my mother-in-law dressed differently when my brother-in-law was coming over, a specific blouse, a particular effort. The way she found reasons to send my husband out on errands whenever his brother was around. The way she talked about my brother-in-law with a softness she reserved for nothing and no one else, calling him so capable, so dependable, in a tone that had nothing maternal in it. Once, on a Sunday in April, I walked into the living room and she was showing him something on her phone, their heads almost touching, and she laughed at whatever he said in a way I had never once heard her laugh. It was unguarded, it was young, it was wrong. By June, I was having trouble sleeping. I want to be clear about something. I did not want to find what I eventually found. I want you to understand that the idea of setting up a camera in my own home made me feel sick. I'm not someone who goes looking for trouble. I'm someone who, for 3 years, had been telling herself there was a reasonable explanation for everything, that good people didn't do the things that I was slowly, reluctantly suspecting. I delayed for months. I talked myself out of it a dozen times. But there is a moment, and I think anyone who has ever lived with a persistent, growing wrongness in their home knows this moment, where the cost of not knowing becomes higher than the cost of finding out. My mother-in-law had started leaving the house on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. She told my husband she was going to her book club. I had once, in passing, mentioned the book club to my sister-in-law, who looked at me blankly and said, "What book club?" She recovered quickly and said she must have gotten confused, but the blankness in that first second before her brain caught up, that stayed with me. I bought a small camera, the kind that looks like a USB charger, the kind that connects to an app on your phone. I put it in the living room, on the shelf behind a row of my mother-in-law's ceramic owls, angled toward the couch. I felt like a criminal doing it. I felt like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. For the first 2 weeks, it recorded nothing I didn't already know. My mother-in-law watching her shows, my husband eating cereal, standing up at the counter, me leaving for work in the morning, not looking at the camera because I was already ashamed of it. Then one Tuesday in October, I got a motion alert on my phone while I was at my desk at work. I almost didn't open it. I sat there for 30 seconds with my phone face down on my desk, and I thought very clearly, once you see it, you can't unsee it. I thought about my wedding day, the ivory dress, my husband's grandmother crying. I thought about the life I thought I was building. Then I picked up my phone and opened the app. I won't describe in detail what I saw, but it was my mother-in-law, and it was my brother-in-law, and it was the living room couch that I sat on every single evening. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the cold tile floor for a long time. I saved everything. I sent copies to my personal email to my cloud storage. I made a backup on a drive I kept in my locker at work. I didn't tell anyone. I went home that night and made dinner and set the table and watched my mother-in-law compliment my husband's taste in wine while she looked right through me, and I said nothing. I was still saying nothing 6 weeks later when Thanksgiving arrived. We were hosting. We always hosted, my mother-in-law insisted, and my husband agreed, and I cooked for 2 days. Turkey, stuffing, roasted squash, 3 kinds of pie. His extended family came from across the GTA, aunts and uncles from Brampton, cousins from Etobicoke, his grandmother who came down from Barrie on the train. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law arrived at 4 with a bottle of Ontario Riesling and matching expressions of ease. The evening was going fine, in the way that evenings go fine, when you are holding something terrible in your chest and smiling across it. I refilled glasses. I brought out the bread. I sat next to my husband and I watched my mother-in-law preside over the table like she always did, warm and certain of her own position, and I thought, not tonight, not yet. I wasn't ready. Then my phone buzzed, a message from my colleague Diane, who was covering my shift that weekend and needed to confirm the schedule, something we'd been going back and forth on for days. It was completely ordinary. It was the kind of message I get a dozen times a week. My husband saw it. He'd reached over for his water glass and glanced at my phone on the table beside my plate, and something in him shifted. I watched it happen. His jaw tightened. He picked up my phone before I could say a word. "Who's Diane?" he said. "My colleague. You've met her. Give me my phone." "She says she'll see you Saturday." His voice had dropped in a way that meant the ceiling was about to fall. What's happening Saturday? I'm covering a shift. Can I have my phone? He stood up. He stood up at the Thanksgiving table with 30 people around it, and he held my phone up, like evidence, and said, loud enough that his grandmother stopped talking mid-sentence across the table, "Does anyone else think it's strange that my wife gets messages from men after hours?" The room went quiet in that particular way. That means everyone is deciding very fast whether to pretend they didn't hear that. Diane is a woman, I said. She's my work colleague, and you need to sit down. I've seen the way you dress for work, he said. He said, I've noticed. And now this. There is no this. His mother's voice came from the other end of the table, smooth and certain. Claire, if there's nothing to hide, you can just explain yourself. That sentence. I have thought about that sentence many times since. The way it positioned me as the defendant. The way it assumed guilt. The way she said it with the confidence of someone who believed she would never in this house ever be the one asked to explain herself. I looked at her. I thought about Tuesday afternoons. I thought about the camera. I thought about the drive in my locker at work, the copies in my cloud, and the video that I had, on a very bad night in October, watched 4 times in a row trying to convince myself it was somehow explainable. You're right, I said. There's nothing to hide. I excused myself from the table. I went to the front closet where my coat was hanging, and I got my phone, my other phone, the old one I'd loaded the footage onto, and I walked back to the dining room. My mother-in-law had already resumed her performance, a light hand on my husband's arm, a murmured word, a posture that said she had everything managed. The television in the adjoining living room was on, playing whatever game someone had put on before dinner. I walked over to it, switched the input to screen mirror, and I opened the video. I want to tell you that I did this calmly. I want to tell you that I was composed. Partly that's true, but I also remember my hands being cold and my heartbeat being loud, and some part of me thinking, very quietly, that there was no version of the next 5 minutes that didn't hurt everyone in that room, including me. The video played. I don't know exactly who registered at first. I think it was my sister-in-law. She made a sound, not a word, just a sound, and then the room went very, very still. My mother-in-law saw herself on the screen. For a moment her face did nothing at all. Then all the architecture of her composure collapsed at once. The chin, the shoulders, the certainty, all of it in about 3 seconds. My brother-in-law went white. My husband stared at the television for so long I wasn't sure he was breathing. His grandmother, God bless her, said very quietly to the cousin sitting next to her, "Turn off the TV, please," and the cousin reached over and did it, and then we sat in the silence of a family that had just had its floor removed. I turned off the screen mirror. I put the phone in my pocket. My mother-in-law recovered first, or tried to. She stood up and pointed at me, and her voice came out high and unsteady. You had no right. You put cameras in this house." "Your house," I said. "You always said it was your house." My brother-in-law had stood up too. He was talking fast, saying the footage was taken out of context, that I'd misunderstood what I was seeing, that there were things I didn't know. My sister-in-law was sitting very still with her hands flat on the table, and I couldn't tell if she was going to cry or be sick or neither. My husband hadn't moved. "Claire," he said finally. His voice was almost nothing. "What?" "I've been trying to tell you something was wrong for 2 years," I said. "You told me I was sensitive. You told me I was imagining things. So I stopped imagining and I started documenting." He opened his mouth and closed it again. "I'm not angry at you," I said, and I meant it, which surprised me. "I'm not angry at anyone in this room. I'm just done." I was staying at my friend's apartment in downtown Toronto that night. I'd already packed a bag. It was in her storage locker. Because I'm organized, because I worked in healthcare administration, because I had, at some level, known this was coming for weeks. I picked up my coat from the chair. I said goodbye to his grandmother, who took my hand and held it for a moment and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. Then I left. The drive to Toronto took 40 minutes. I put on the radio and I didn't cry until I hit the 427, and then I cried for about 8 minutes straight, and then I stopped. Because I am, as my colleagues say, the calm one. And because something in me had already shifted into a quieter gear. Not numb, but finished. The way you feel after a very long conversation that should have happened years ago. My friend opened the door in her pajamas and handed me a glass of wine without a word. We watched 3 episodes of a reality show I'd never seen before. I slept for 9 hours. It was the best sleep I'd had in 2 years. I called a family lawyer the next morning. She was recommended by someone from work, a woman who specialized in high conflict separations and who had, in her first 5 minutes with me, the particular energy of someone who has seen a great deal of human behavior and remained unimpressed by all of it. When I showed her the footage, which I'd been careful to record only in common areas, nothing that crossed into privacy law issues I'd researched thoroughly before I ever touched a camera, she told me my case was very strong. In Ontario, she explained, what I had documented could be used as evidence of a hostile household environment and was relevant to asset division. The matrimonial home question. My mother-in-law had always insisted it was hers in spirit, though legally my husband and I were both on the title, was now going to be extremely interesting. The aftermath unfolded the way these things always do, faster than you expect and slower than you want. My brother-in-law's wife filed for separation within the month. From what mutual friends told me, she was shattered, but also, eventually, something else, something harder and cleaner. I understood that. When the thing you feared most actually happens, there's a strange relief in the knowing. The waiting is over. The shape of the thing is clear. Now you just deal with it. My mother-in-law left the house. She went to stay with her sister in Hamilton and, from everything I heard, was not particularly welcomed. Her sister had known her for 60-odd years and had, apparently, her own opinions. My husband called me several times in the first few weeks. I let most of them go to voicemail. The messages were not angry. I'll give him that. They were bewildered and sad and full of the particular remorse of someone who has just learned they spent years looking in the wrong direction. He didn't ask me to come back, he just said he was sorry he hadn't listened. In the last message, he said he'd started seeing a therapist, which I thought was the right thing to do, and said so in a text, which was the only reply I sent. The divorce was settled without going to court. My lawyer was good, the evidence was what it was, and my husband, whatever his failures as a husband, was not stupid, and he knew when a fight was unwinnable. We sold the house. Given the market, even split, I came out with enough to cover a down payment on a small place of my own, which I found in the east end of Hamilton, cheaper than Toronto, quieter, a building with a garden that I can see from my kitchen window. I painted my bedroom a color called worn denim. I bought plants. I got a library card. My sister-in-law texted me in the spring, about 6 months after Thanksgiving. I hadn't expected to hear from her. The message was short. I know we don't know each other well. I'm sorry I was cold to you when you first joined the family. I understand some things better now. I hope you're okay. I wrote back that I was, and that I hoped she was too, and I meant it both times. My mother-in-law I've not heard from. I don't expect to. My brother-in-law, the last I heard through a friend, had moved to Calgary and was starting over. I don't have feelings about that one way or another. People go where they go. I think about my marriage sometimes, not with bitterness, but with the particular thoughtfulness of someone trying to learn from a long, expensive lesson. I was so committed to being the patient one, the reasonable one, the one who didn't make things dramatic, that I spent 5 years making myself smaller to preserve a peace that was never real. I thought that tolerating things quietly was the generous choice. What I understand now is that tolerance without limits isn't generosity, it's just a slow kind of disappearing. The thing I wish someone had told me earlier is this: trust your instincts, not in a dramatic way, not in a ripping up your life way. Just, when your body keeps telling you something is wrong, stop explaining it away. Stop being so reasonable about it. You're allowed to know what you know. I'm not seeing anyone right now, and I'm not in a hurry. I have my job, which I'm good at. I have my apartment, which is mine. I have my friend who opened the door in her pajamas on Thanksgiving night and didn't ask me anything until I was ready to talk, which is its own kind of love. I'm not the same woman who stood in that kitchen in her coat at midnight listening to voices on the back porch and telling herself she was imagining things. I am, if anything, more myself than I've ever been. Quieter in some ways, more willing to speak in others. I know the difference now between keeping the peace and keeping the pretense, and I will never again mistake one for the other. My bedroom window faces east. On clear mornings, I make coffee and I sit with it in both hands and I watch the light come in. And I think, this is mine. This quiet. This window. This life. I worked hard for this. It is enough. It is, in fact, more than enough. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to walk out of a room that has, in some ways, been your whole life for 5 years. It's not courage, exactly, not the dramatic kind you read about. It's something quieter than that. It's the moment you finally stop arguing with what you already know. What happened to me didn't happen because my husband was a monster. It happened because he was a man who found it easier to look away than to look directly at something uncomfortable. And I stayed in that dynamic for years because I told myself that patience was a virtue, that accommodation was love, that keeping the peace was worth the cost. I was wrong on all three counts. What I was practicing wasn't virtue, it was a slow erosion of my own judgment. Every time I explained away what I was seeing, every time I talked myself down from trusting my instincts, I wasn't being generous. I was teaching myself that my own perception couldn't be trusted. That's not a small thing to unlearn. The people in my story didn't suffer consequences because the universe punished them. They suffered consequences because their choices had logical endpoints. My mother-in-law had spent years building a version of herself that everyone around her was expected to maintain. My brother-in-law had chosen convenience and secrecy over integrity so many times that deception became structural to his life. Those choices compound. They always do. The weight of what you're hiding grows heavier than what you're protecting, and eventually something gives. I didn't cause their collapse. I just stopped being the person who absorbed the pressure so they didn't have to. What I understand now, sitting in my own apartment with my own plants and my coffee in the morning light, is that integrity isn't something you display when things are easy. It's the thing you reach for when everything in you wants to go along, to keep the peace, to not be the one who makes it complicated. It took me 5 years to understand that the most honest thing I could do, for myself, for my sister-in-law who was being deceived in her own marriage, even for my husband who had taught himself not to see, was to stop pretending I hadn't seen it either. There's a version of that Thanksgiving night where I said nothing, where I folded, where I went back to the table and refilled glasses and told myself again that I must be imagining things. I almost lived that version. The only reason I didn't is that I had spent the previous 6 weeks sitting very quietly with the truth, letting it become solid and real in a way I couldn't talk myself out of. That's not a comfortable process, but it's necessary. You can't act clearly from a place of confusion. You have to be willing to let yourself know what you know, even when knowing it changes everything. I'm not a particularly brave person. I'm organized, I'm patient, and I work in healthcare administration. None of those things are usually associated with dramatic confrontations at the family dinner table. But I think the bravery, if you want to call it that, wasn't in the moment I picked up the phone. It was in every quiet, unglamorous decision in the months before. To look when it was easier not to document when I wanted to deny, to call a lawyer before I was ready, to pack a bag before I knew for certain I'd need it. The woman who sat on her friend's couch at midnight on Thanksgiving, drinking wine in her coat, was not defeated. She was finally, after a very long time, going in the right direction.